Large, steam-powered ships took to the seas after 1880, replacing the older, slower sailing ships, which meant it was suddenly much faster and cheaper to cross the ocean, making the dream of a journey to America more accessible to many around the world.
Processed and ticketed, they waited for their ship. They boarded in many parts of Europe and in many kinds of vessels, most to New York and some to other ports. But they had one thing in common. They were traveling steerage, and the steamship companies understood the profit in numbers.
Before long, millions of immigrants were arriving on America's shores. They passed through immigration processing stations like Ellis Island in New York and Angel Island in San Francisco Bay. This wave was much more diverse than before. Coming mainly from Southern Europe, it was led by Italians, Poles, Greeks, Swedes, Norwegians, Hungarians, Jews, Lebanese, and Syrians.
It was as if God's great promise had been fulfilled.
I've gone into a free land. I don't think I ever can explain that feeling that I had that time.
It's not my native land, but it means more to me than my native land. It means more to me than my native land.
Any country on earth, this never happened. And become a human being again. It's a miracle.
And everybody had hopes. And one thing I was sure, and thousands like me, that the degradation, the abuse, and the privation that we had in Europe, we wouldn't have here.
This group was young. Most were under 30 years old, mainly because an entire generation of the children of farmers and factory workers in Europe and the Russian Empire couldn't find work because the owners of the farms and factories preferred to have an efficient machine that they didn't have to pay do the work instead of a human being. Well, this was fine by America, whose steel, coal, automobile, textile, and garment production industries were booming. It happily took in this pool of eager, hard workers and put them to work in its growing industrial cities.
As mills and factories sprouted across the land, cities grew up around them. In turn, the cities beckoned to workers by the millions from the American countryside and from overseas to fuel the burgeoning industrialization. What was once a rural nation was rapidly becoming an urban state. Between 1860 and 1910, the urban population grew from 6 million to over 44 million.
The United States also took full advantage of Europe's paralyzation during the First World War. With millions dying in the midst of the bloodiest struggle the European continent had ever seen, every country there had to completely focus its industries on producing all the supplies, the guns, the uniforms, the tanks, the boats, the bullets, all the stuff needed to carry on and win the fight. But with many of its working aged men on the front lines, in hospitals, or at home after horrific injuries, or dead, the factories of Europe couldn't meet all the demand, so US factories made up for the shortfall in production. Before long, the United States had leapt to the front ranks of the world's economic giants. And when the Americans entered the conflict themselves in 1917, US industry was now tasked with supplying its own soldiers too. It was during this 50-year immigration wave, from about 1870 to 1920, when many well-off, white, native-born Americans began to consider mass immigration a danger to the health and security of the country. They started actively organizing to exert political power to slow it down. The first immigration law in American history was known as the Asian Exclusion Act. It was passed in 1875 and, you guessed it, outlawed Asians, specifically Asian contract laborers, from stepping foot on American soil, plus any other people considered convicts in their own countries. In 1921, Congress pushed through a law that marked a turning point in American immigration policy, a law that passed the Senate 78-1. The Emergency Quota Act set strict limits on the amount of immigrants who would be allowed into the country each year. It was very effective. The number of new immigrants let in fell from over 800,000 in 1920 to just over 300,000 admitted in 1921. If the pace of immigration had been like a raging river, this law acted like a dam. But that drop-off in the flow of persons into America still didn't satisfy the anti-immigration crowd who, just 3 years later in 1924, forced Congress to tighten the quota even more, established the Border Patrol, and stated that any undocumented immigrants who entered the country were subject to deportation. It's during this time that the definition of illegal alien was born, a term that would be used to stigmatize the next group the anti-immigration community's crosshairs became fixed on: Latin American migrants living and working in the US Southwest. Thank you for watching this fourth part of our examination of America's history of immigration. Click the screen to watch part 5 or start with part 1. You can also watch our documentary on the 10 most incredible infrastructure megaprojects under construction throughout the world, or our most recent video. For TDC, I'm Bryce Plank. The other half of our team is Brendan Plank, the editor of these videos.